They teach you that world wars start with invasions and assassinations. But the truth is far more disturbing. Every major war in modern history began the moment the global financial system couldn't sustain the lies anymore. You've been told the story backwards your entire life, shown the soldiers and the borders, while the real trigger, the mathematical impossibility hidden in sovereign debt and currency collapse, stayed buried in classified documents and central bank ledgers. This isn't conspiracy. This is pattern recognition across 3 centuries of financial history. And right now, in January 2026, that exact same pattern just went live. Let me show you something they don't want you to see. On January 15, 2026, the United States Treasury crossed $38 trillion in national debt. Not 37.9, 38 trillion, with a capital T. That number should mean something to you, because it represents the exact moment when mathematics stopped caring about politics, stopped caring about optimism, stopped caring about any narrative except one. This debt can never be repaid. Not with growth, not with taxes, not with policy. The only ways out are default, hyperinflation, or erasing the people you owe by destroying them. History chose option 3, twice. In 1914 and 1939, and right now, the same choice is being calculated in rooms you'll never enter by people whose names you'll never know. But here's what should absolutely terrify you about this moment. While financial media is telling you to stay calm, that the economy is resilient, that the Fed has tools, that we've been through worse, the U.S. government is now spending $6 billion per day just to pay interest on money we already borrowed. Not building infrastructure, not funding education, not defending borders. $6 billion a day just to service the debt, to keep the Ponzi scheme running one more quarter. That's more than the entire annual GDP of 70 countries, per day, on interest alone. Sarah Mitchell still remembers the exact moment she understood her retirement was gone. It was a Tuesday morning in late January, sitting in her kitchen in Columbus, Ohio, staring at her 401k statement that showed her account down 42% in 6 weeks. She's 58 years old, a nurse practitioner who did everything right for 30 years. Maxed out contributions, diversified portfolio, listened to every expert. $370,000, carefully built over 3 decades of night shifts and double overtime, reduced to $214,000 in a month and a half. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just sat there, holding that piece of paper, watching her future collapse into numbers that don't add up anymore, realizing that the rules changed and nobody told her until it was too late. Here's the question nobody in power wants you to ask. If the U.S. economy is so strong, why are central banks around the world dumping U.S. Treasury bonds at the fastest rate in recorded history? In the last 90 days, foreign holders sold over $400 billion in treasuries. China dumped $120 billion. Japan, our supposed ally, unloaded $85 billion. Saudi Arabia, another ally, sold $62 billion. These aren't random moves. These are coordinated exits by people who see the same data you're not being shown, who understand that holding dollar-denominated debt is now an act of financial suicide. Meanwhile, Marcus Chen made $8 million in 3 months. He's 34, runs a macro hedge fund in Singapore, and he saw this coming 18 months ago. While Sarah Mitchell's life savings were evaporating, Marcus was shorting regional U.S. banks, buying physical gold stored in Switzerland and Singapore, and positioning his fund's $2.3 billion in assets for the exact collapse that just started. When Silicon Valley Bank imploded in March 2023, Marcus made $47 million in a single week. He didn't cause the crisis. He just understood the pattern that people like Sarah were never taught to recognize. On January 23, 2026, while Sarah was calculating whether she could afford to retire at 70 instead of 65, Marcus was in Zurich, finalizing the purchase of his third property, a $14 million chalet, paid in cash, because he knows what happens to paper wealth when the empire falls. Picture this clearly in your mind. A world map from January 2026. But instead of colored countries, you're seeing bright red lines showing capital flight. Money hemorrhaging out of the United States at unprecedented speed, pouring into physical assets, into rival currencies, into anything that isn't a claim on a system that's mathematically broken. The visualization would look like a patient bleeding out on an operating table. Except the doctors are the ones making the cuts. Now, here's what most people get completely wrong about financial crisis. They think it's about bad decisions by a few reckless bankers or politicians. They think if we just had better regulations, smarter people in charge, more oversight, we could prevent this. That's not how systemic collapse works. This isn't about individual failure. This is about mathematical inevitability built into the structure itself. When you create a debt-based monetary system, promise infinite growth on a finite planet, and allow central banks to print unlimited currency to cover unlimited borrowing, there's only one possible endpoint. Not if, when. And that when is right now, in January 2026. Because the $38 trillion debt crossed the event horizon, where compound interest alone ensures it can never be repaid. But debt is just the visible wound. The real hemorrhaging is happening in something far more critical: trust in the system itself. On January 19, 2026, gold hit $4,600 per ounce, an all-time record that shattered every previous high. That's not investors being paranoid. That's smart money voting with billions of dollars that the paper promises from central banks and governments are becoming worthless. Gold doesn't pay dividends. It doesn't generate cash flow. It just sits there, heavy and inert. The only time gold rockets to all-time highs is when the alternative, trusting government-issued currency, becomes more dangerous than holding a metal that's been recognized as value for 5,000 years. James Rodriguez is 41, a commercial real estate developer in Miami, who borrowed $63 million in 2021 at 2.7% interest to build a mixed-use development. Those loans mature in 8 months, in September 2026. And the refinancing rate isn't 2.7 anymore. It's 7.2%. James did the math last week, sitting in his office at 2 in the morning, running the numbers over and over, hoping the calculator was broken. It wasn't. At the new rate, his interest payments alone would exceed the property's total rental income. The building that was supposed to secure his family's wealth for generations is now a concrete monument to miscalculation. And James is one of thousands of developers, business owners, and corporate CFOs waking up to the same nightmare. The cheap money era just ended, and the bill is coming due in months, not years. So ask yourself this second question, and answer it honestly. If the crisis hasn't started yet, why are the indicators that appeared before every historical collapse now flashing simultaneously for the first time since 1939? And if it has started, what comes after the money dies? The pattern is already in motion. You just haven't been told what happens in Act 2. To understand why January 2026 feels like standing on the edge of something catastrophic, you need to understand a mechanism that's been hidden in plain sight for over a century. It's not complicated. It's actually brutally simple. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The mechanism works like this. Whoever controls the global reserve currency controls the world, not through military force first, but through the ability to print money that other countries must accept as payment for real goods. It's the ultimate counterfeiting operation, except it's completely legal, and it only breaks down when the countries providing real goods, oil, manufacturing, food, finally realize they're being paid in paper that's worth less every single day. In 1914, that currency was the British pound sterling. If you wanted to trade internationally, buy commodities, finance business expansion, you needed pounds. The Bank of England in London was the center of the financial universe, and they used that position as a weapon. Picture the global economy as a massive card game, where Britain got to print their own chips while everyone else had to earn theirs through actual production. As long as everyone believed those chips had value, the system worked. The moment that belief cracked, everything collapsed. And belief didn't crack because of irrational panic. It cracked because the math stopped working. Here's what actually happened in the decade before 1914, the part they don't teach you in history class. Germany had become the industrial powerhouse of Europe. Their steel production surpassed Britain's in 1893. Their chemical industry dominated the world. Their electrical manufacturing was 20 years ahead of anyone else. They were more efficient, more innovative, more productive. But there was a problem. All international trade required pounds sterling, and Britain controlled the supply of pounds through the Bank of England. If you were a German manufacturer trying to import raw materials from South America or export finished goods to Asia, you had to convert your currency through London, pay their fees, accept their exchange rates, and operate within their system. Germany was economically superior, but financially subordinate, and that contradiction couldn't last. Thomas Bauer was 37 in 1912, ran a textile manufacturing company in Hamburg with 140 employees. His factory produced the highest quality cotton fabric in Europe, shipped to clients in 12 countries. But in the spring of 1912, his British suppliers suddenly demanded payment exclusively in pounds sterling, instead of accepting gold or German marks as they had for 15 years. Thomas tried to negotiate, tried to find alternative suppliers. But the pattern was everywhere. British financial institutions were systematically cutting German businesses off from credit, restricting access to trade financing, making it exponentially more expensive to do international business. He sat in his office overlooking the factory floor, where machines ran at full capacity, orders backed up for months, workers depending on his decisions, and realized, with absolute clarity, that his business was being strangled not by competition, but by financial warfare. The British weren't trying to outcompete Germany. They were trying to economically suffocate them, using the pound as a noose. Now ask yourself this: does that pattern sound familiar? Because in 2026, replace British pound with US dollar, and replace Germany with China. And you're watching the exact same mechanism play out in real time. The United States has controlled the global reserve currency since 1944, when the Bretton Woods Agreement made the dollar the center of international trade. For 80 years, America has enjoyed what's called exorbitant privilege. We print dollars, and the world accepts them as payment for real goods. We import German cars, Japanese electronics, Chinese manufacturing, Middle Eastern oil, and we pay with currency that our central bank creates at will. It's the greatest wealth transfer mechanism in human history, and it only functions as long as other countries believe those dollars will hold value. That belief is dying right now, in January 2026, and you can see it in the numbers they can't hide. What most people get completely wrong about reserve currency collapse is they think it happens suddenly, like a stock market crash or a bank failure. It doesn't. It happens gradually, then all at once. First, foreign central banks slow down their purchases of U.S. Treasury bonds. Then they stop buying new bonds. Then they start selling the bonds they already hold. Then they diversify into other currencies, gold, commodities, anything except dollars. Then trade settlement shifts away from dollars. Then the demand for dollars collapses, And suddenly, the currency that was backed by full faith and credit is revealed to be backed by nothing except the military's ability to force others to accept it. And that final stage, where financial power must be replaced by military force, that's when wars start. Remember Sarah Mitchell from Ohio, the nurse who watched her retirement evaporate? Her 401k wasn't invested in risky crypto or speculative stocks. She was in standard index funds, the safe, boring investments every advisor recommends. But here's what Sarah doesn't know yet, what her financial advisor will never explain to her. Those funds are denominated in dollars, priced in dollars, valued in dollars. If the dollar loses 50% of its international purchasing power, Sarah's account might say it's worth $214,000. But what that money can actually buy gets cut in half regardless of what the statement shows. The number stays the same while the value evaporates. It's the perfect crime because the victim doesn't realize they've been robbed until they try to spend the money and discover it buys half of what it used to. Here's the mechanism they really don't want you to understand. When a country runs massive deficits year after year, decade after decade, they're not borrowing from some abstract future. They're borrowing from specific countries that hold their bonds. As of January 2026, foreign governments and institutions hold approximately $7 trillion in U.S. Treasury bonds. That's $7 trillion that China, Japan, Saudi Arabia, and others gave us in exchange for real goods, and we gave them paper promises to repay. Now those countries are looking at U.S. debt approaching $40 trillion, looking at the Federal Reserve printing trillions more to cover deficits, and doing basic math that a fifth grader could follow. If the U.S. owes $40 trillion and only collects $4 trillion in tax revenue annually, and interest payments alone consume $6 billion per day, how exactly does this get repaid? The answer is, it doesn't. It can't. The math doesn't work. So those countries holding $7 trillion in treasury bonds are making the only rational decision. Get out while those bonds still have some value. Chen Wei is 53 years old, a director at the People's Bank of China, though you'll never see his name in public records. In a secured conference room in Beijing on December 18, 2025, Chen and 14 other officials reviewed detailed projections of U.S. dollar stability over the next 18 months. The conclusion was unanimous and terrifying in its simplicity. The United States could not service its debt without either massive currency devaluation or default. Chen didn't make this decision lightly. His daughter studies economics at UCLA. His son works for a tech company in Seattle. He personally holds $2 million in U.S. investments. But the mathematics didn't care about his personal connections or preferences. In the 6 weeks since that meeting, China has dumped $120 billion in treasury bonds. And Chen knows they're preparing to dump $300 billion more by June. He's not trying to destroy America. He's trying to save China from being destroyed when the dollar collapses, and the mathematics say that collapse is now inevitable. Just a question of months, not years. Picture a massive game of musical chairs playing out across global finance. 20 countries standing, but only 15 chairs. The music is still playing, international trade continues, dollars still get accepted, systems still function. But everyone in the room can hear the music getting quieter, slower, and they're all calculating the exact moment to move toward a chair before the music stops. The countries that move first preserve their wealth. The countries that move last get crushed. This isn't cooperation. This is coordination in a prisoner's dilemma, where the only winning move is to defect before everyone else does. Here's the contrarian truth they definitely don't want you to realize. The crisis isn't being caused by external enemies or foreign adversaries trying to destroy America. It's being caused by basic mathematics finally overcoming political narratives. We did this to ourselves through 40 years of deficit spending, quantitative easing, and the assumption that reserve currency status meant we could ignore economic reality forever. China isn't attacking us. They're protecting themselves from our collapse. And that's actually more dangerous because it means this isn't fixable through diplomacy or negotiation. Mathematics doesn't negotiate. The mechanism is now in motion. Foreign holders are exiting. Domestic inflation is accelerating. The maturity wall for corporate and government debt is approaching, and every single decision being made in Washington, Beijing, Brussels, and Moscow right now is based on the same calculation. When the music stops, how do we make sure we're not the ones left standing? That calculation, that zero-sum game playing out between nuclear powers with 40 trillion reasons to panic, that's not the build-up to crisis. That's the crisis itself, already live, counting down to the moment when someone decides that force is cheaper than finance. And we're about to see exactly what happens when that moment arrives. Here's what they're not telling you about March 2023, and here's why it matters more than anything else you'll hear today. When Silicon Valley Bank collapsed on March 10th, the official story was simple: poor risk management, some bad bond bets, a bank run triggered by social media panic. Regional problem, isolated incident. The system contained it. Move along. That story is a lie. Not an exaggeration, not a simplification, a deliberate lie designed to hide what actually happened. Because if you understood what actually happened, you'd realize we crossed a point of no return 2 years ago, and everything since then has been theater. Silicon Valley Bank didn't fail because of mismanagement. It failed because of the mathematical reality that every bank in America faces right now in January 2026. When you deposit money in a bank, you think that money sits in a vault waiting for you. It doesn't. Banks take your deposits and buy assets, primarily U.S. Treasury bonds, because regulations classify those bonds as safe and liquid. Silicon Valley Bank did exactly what they were supposed to do. They took customer deposits and bought 10-year Treasury bonds in 2020 and 2021, when rates were at 0.5%. Safe, stable, government-backed. Except there's a problem with bonds that nobody explains to depositors. When interest rates rise, existing bonds lose value. If you bought a bond paying 0.5% and rates jump to 5%, your old bond is now worth substantially less because nobody wants to hold an asset paying 0.5 when they can get 5% elsewhere. This isn't theory. This is accounting. Silicon Valley Bank held $120 billion in bonds that had lost $22 billion in value when rates spiked. On paper, they were insolvent. They just hoped nobody would notice. Jennifer Zhao noticed. She's 42, runs a biotech startup in South San Francisco, had $11 million in her company's operating account at Silicon Valley Bank. On March 8, 2023, she attended a venture capital dinner where someone mentioned that SVB's bond portfolio was underwater. Jennifer didn't panic. She just did basic math. That night at 11:30 p.m., sitting on her living room couch with her laptop, she logged into her company's account and initiated a wire transfer to move all $11 million to JP Morgan. The transfer would process the next morning. She slept fine. At 6:45 a.m., her phone started exploding with texts from other founders asking if she'd gotten her money out. By 9:30 a.m., $8 billion in withdrawal requests had hit Silicon Valley Bank. By noon, the FDIC had seized the bank. By 3 p.m., Jennifer's wire transfer was frozen. Her $11 million, money she needed to make Friday's payroll for 73 employees, money she'd raised over 3 years from investors who trusted her, was stuck in a failed bank. She sat in her office that afternoon, and the only thing she could think was that she'd done everything right, followed every rule, kept money in an FDIC-insured institution, and it didn't matter. The system broke anyway. But here's the part that should make your blood boil. Within 72 hours, The Federal Reserve and Treasury Department announced an emergency program. Every depositor at Silicon Valley Bank would be made whole, even depositors with balances far exceeding the FDIC insurance limit of $250,000. Jennifer got her $11 million back. So did every venture capital firm, every tech company, every wealthy depositor who banked there. Total cost of the bailout? $215 billion, created by the Federal Reserve, essentially out of thin air. Remember Sarah Mitchell from Ohio? While Jennifer got rescued within 3 days, Sarah's watching her retirement account crater by 42%, with zero government intervention, zero bailout, zero emergency program. Both are victims of the same crisis: interest rates destroying asset values. But one gets made whole by printing money, while the other gets told that's just how markets work. That's not economics. That's a protection racket, where the elite gets socialism and everyone else gets capitalism. Now pause this video for 5 seconds and ask yourself, if the system was stable, if everything was fine, why did the government need to print $215 billion in emergency funds in 72 hours to prevent a complete banking collapse? The answer is because Silicon Valley Bank wasn't an isolated incident. It was a preview. There are 4,127 banks in the United States, and hundreds of them have the same problem. Bond portfolios underwater, depositors who could run at any moment, and balance sheets that only work if nobody looks too closely. Marcus Chen, the hedge fund manager from Singapore, who made $8 million shorting this exact scenario, he understood something that Jennifer and Sarah didn't. The system isn't designed to protect everyone. It's designed to protect the people who understand that the system is broken and position themselves accordingly. Marcus didn't cause Silicon Valley Bank to fail. He just bet correctly that a bank holding long-term bonds at 0% interest in a rising rate environment would eventually implode. He made $47 million in March 2023, while Jennifer nearly lost her company, and Sarah lost 42% of her retirement. Same crisis, 3 completely different outcomes, and the difference had nothing to do with who worked harder or who was smarter. It had everything to do with who understood the mechanism and who didn't. What most people get completely wrong about the 2026 crisis is they think it's about a few bad banks or some mismanaged companies. This is structural. Imagine a photograph of the United States taken from space, but instead of showing cities and roads, it shows debt. Every corporate bond, every government obligation, every mortgage, every loan. You'd see a web of interconnected obligations so dense and so massive that it looks like a living organism. Now picture that organism suffocating because the oxygen, cheap money at 0%, just got replaced with expensive money at 5 to 6%. Every cell in that organism has to refinance, has to pay higher rates, has to somehow generate enough cash flow to service debt that just tripled in cost. Some cells die immediately. Some struggle. But the organism as a whole cannot survive this environment. It was built for 0%. It cannot function at 5%. The math doesn't work. David Park is 56 CFO of a mid-sized manufacturing company in Ohio that employs 2,400 people. His company borrowed $800 million in 2020 at 1.9% interest to expand production facilities. That debt matures in August 2026, 5 months from now. David has spent the last 3 weeks negotiating with 9 different banks trying to refinance. The best rate anyone will offer is 7.3%. At 1.9%, annual interest was $15 million. At 7.3%, annual interest jumps to $58 million. The company's annual profit last year was $61 million. David sat in his office last Thursday, running projections, and every scenario ends the same way. The company cannot afford to refinance at current rates. They either default, file bankruptcy, or somehow generate 4 times more profit in the next 12 months. On Friday morning, David had to schedule a meeting with the CEO to explain that the company he's worked at for 27 years, that's been profitable for 40 years, that builds parts for everything from cars to medical devices, is probably going to fail in 6 months, not because of competition, not because of poor management, but because the Federal Reserve raised interest rates and now they literally cannot afford to borrow money. 2,400 people have no idea their jobs are about to disappear. Here's the twist nobody saw coming. The Federal Reserve didn't raise rates to fight inflation. That's the public story, the simple narrative for TV news. The real reason, the one that officials will never say publicly, is that they had to raise rates to attract foreign buyers for U.S. Treasury bonds. Remember Chen Wei from the People's Bank of China, the official who authorized dumping $120 billion in treasuries? When foreign central banks stop buying U.S. bonds, the Federal Reserve has 2 choices. Let bond prices collapse, which would spike interest rates uncontrollably and crash the economy immediately, or raise rates themselves in a controlled way to make bonds attractive again to buyers. They chose option 2. They raised rates to try to keep foreign money flowing in. But here's the catastrophic unintended consequence. In trying to save the Treasury bond market, they destroyed every company, every bank, every borrower that depends on cheap money. They saved the government's ability to borrow by sacrificing the private sector's ability to survive. David Park's company, Jennifer Zhao's startup, millions of businesses across America. They're all casualties of a desperate attempt to keep foreign central banks from abandoning U.S. debt entirely. And it's not working. Despite rate increases, foreign holders are still selling. China, Japan, Saudi Arabia, they're all reducing treasury positions because they can do math better than the Federal Reserve can lie. The mechanism is now self-reinforcing. Foreign selling forces rates higher. Higher rates destroy more companies. Company failures weaken the economy. A weaker economy makes foreign holders want to sell even more. It's a doom loop, and we entered it in January 2026 with $38 trillion in debt and no mathematical path to escape. Catherine Moore is 68 years old, a retired teacher in Arizona living on Social Security and a small pension. In February 2026, her monthly grocery bill jumped from $340 to $520. Her prescription medication cost increased from $115 to $210. Her homeowner's insurance doubled from $108 monthly to $217. Her total fixed expenses increased by $703 per month, while her Social Security check increased by $41. Catherine doesn't follow markets. She doesn't watch financial news. She just knows that money doesn't go as far, and she's cutting her pills in half to make them last longer, which her doctor told her not to do, but she has no choice. While Jennifer got bailed out in 72 hours and Marcus made millions, Catherine is deciding between medication and food, and nobody in Washington is printing money for her. That's the rage moment. That's the injustice that should make you absolutely furious. The system will move heaven and earth, will create hundreds of billions in 72 hours to protect Silicon Valley depositors. But Catherine Moore can go ahead and cut her heart medication in half. The cruelty isn't incidental. It's structural. The system is working exactly as designed, just not for people like Catherine. So ask yourself this. When the next wave of bank failures hits in the coming months, when the corporate bankruptcy surge begins, when unemployment spikes to double digits, who gets saved and who gets sacrificed? Because that choice has already been made, in meetings you'll never see, by people whose names you'll never know, and the pattern is clear. Elite interests get bailouts. Everyone else gets advice to tighten their belts and be resilient. The decisions that will determine the next 10 years are being made right now. Not by elected officials, not by voters, by central bankers calculating whether it's cheaper to let the system collapse or print enough money to keep it alive one more quarter, knowing that every trillion printed destroys more purchasing power and pushes us closer to the moment when foreign holders abandon the dollar entirely. And when that moment comes, when the reserve currency dies, we're not talking about recession anymore. We're talking about the end of American financial dominance and what desperate nuclear powers do when they lose the ability to print money the world accepts. The mathematics didn't wait for permission. February 2026 arrived with the subtlety of a freight train, and the corporate bankruptcy filings started appearing in federal courts at a rate nobody had seen since 2009. 17 major companies filed Chapter 11 in the first week alone. But these weren't the dramatic collapses that make headlines. These were the quiet deaths. The manufacturing firms and retail chains and commercial real estate developers that employed 50,000 people collectively. Companies whose names most Americans wouldn't recognize until the day their local store closed or their factory announced layoffs. David Park's manufacturing company in Ohio, the one that couldn't afford to refinance $800 million at 7.3%, filed on February 19th. The press release used words like restructuring and optimization. What they meant was that 2,400 people were about to lose their jobs, their health insurance, and their belief that doing good work for 20 years meant anything at all. Michael Torres got the email on a Wednesday morning at 6:47 a.m. He's 39, worked the third shift as a machinist at David Park's company for 11 years, never missed a day, trained 6 new employees, and thought he'd retire from there eventually. The email was 3 paragraphs long and explained that, due to market conditions beyond the company's control, his position was being eliminated effective immediately. No severance beyond 2 weeks. Health insurance would terminate in 30 days. Michael read it twice, sitting in his truck in the employee parking lot, still wearing his work boots and high-vis vest. And the only thought running through his mind was that he had 3 kids, a mortgage at 4.8% that he'd locked in thinking he was smart, and exactly $2,100 in savings. His wife Amanda worked part-time at a dental office, making $14 an hour. Combined, they'd been making it work, barely, and now the math just stopped adding up entirely. That same morning, Marcus Chen was reviewing his fund's Q1 performance in his Singapore office. The fund was up 18% for the quarter, primarily from short positions on commercial real estate and regional banks. Marcus had moved another $40 million into physical gold stored in Switzerland 2 weeks earlier, when he saw the bankruptcy filings accelerating. He wasn't celebrating. He was calculating. His models predicted another wave in March, bigger than February, and then the real cascade in April and May, when the bond maturities hit peak volume. Marcus Chen didn't cause Michael Torres to lose his job, but he profited from the same mathematical inevitability that destroyed it. And the distance between their realities measured in more than just dollars. It measured in the simple truth that some people see the pattern, and some people are the pattern's victims. By March 15th, weekly unemployment claims hit 412,000, up from 190,000 in January. The financial media called it concerning but manageable. What they didn't report was that the methodology for calculating unemployment claims had been changed 3 times since 2008 to make the numbers look better. And even with those adjustments, even with the statistical manipulation, the trend was unmistakable. The corporate debt maturity wall wasn't a metaphor anymore. It was hitting in real time. And companies that had survived on cheap borrowed money for 5 years were discovering that expensive money killed them in 5 months. Jennifer Zhao's biotech startup, the one that nearly died when Silicon Valley Bank collapsed. She'd survived that crisis, but March brought a different problem. Her company needed to raise another $20 million to fund clinical trials, and her lead investor, a venture capital firm that had committed verbally in December, sent her an email on March 8th explaining that due to current market volatility, they were pausing all new investments indefinitely. Jennifer spent 72 hours calling every contact she had, every firm that had shown interest, and the answer was always the same polite version of no. By March 11th, she was sitting in her CFO's office, running the numbers, and the numbers said they had operating capital for 93 more days. After that, the company dissolved. 11 years of research, 3 promising drug candidates, 73 employees who'd believed in the mission. All of it would just stop existing, because nobody wanted to deploy capital in a deteriorating market. Jennifer didn't cry. She just felt hollow, understanding for the first time that all her work and intelligence meant nothing against a tide of money moving in the opposite direction. The first regional bank failure hit on March 22nd. Commonwealth Bank of Georgia, assets of $8.3 billion, deposits from 94,000 customers, went into FDIC receivership on a Friday afternoon. The official statement mentioned liquidity pressures and unexpected deposit withdrawals, but anyone paying attention knew exactly what happened. The bank held commercial real estate loans that were defaulting at accelerating rates, and they'd tried to shore up their position by selling treasury bonds at a 28% loss. The combination killed them. The FDIC moved quickly, arranged a purchase by a larger bank over the weekend, and by Monday morning, depositors could access their accounts again. No panic. System working as designed. Except this was bank number 4 in 12 months, and the mathematics said there were dozens more with similar problems. And the FDIC's insurance fund held $128 billion to cover potential losses across an entire banking system with $23 trillion in deposits. The math didn't work. Everyone knew it. They just kept pretending it did. Catherine Moore, the retired teacher in Arizona who'd been cutting her medication in half, she banked at Commonwealth. Her total deposits were $43,000. Her emergency fund built over 40 years of teaching. And when the bank failed, she lost access to her money for 4 days. 4 days doesn't sound like much, unless you're 68 years old, with prescriptions that need refilling, and automatic payments that need to clear, and a level of anxiety that makes your heart race at 3 a.m., wondering if everything you saved is actually gone. When her account access came back on Tuesday, Catherine checked her balance 17 times that day to make sure the money was really there. She trusted banks her entire life, the same way she trusted that Social Security would exist, and prescription costs would stay reasonable, and retirement would mean security. Every single one of those trusts was breaking at the same time, and Catherine didn't have the energy to be angry anymore. She just felt tired and betrayed, and utterly alone in a system that kept changing rules she'd followed faithfully for 7 decades. April brought the acceleration everyone with a calculator had been predicting. Corporate bankruptcies jumped to 47 for the month. Unemployment claims broke 600,000 per week. Consumer spending dropped 11% month over month, the steepest decline outside of recession in 30 years. Retail chains started announcing closures. Shopping malls that had been dying slowly for a decade suddenly died fast. But the real damage was happening in a place most Americans never look: the commercial real estate market. Office buildings in major cities were sitting 30 to 40% vacant as remote work became permanent, and the loans on those buildings were coming due. The owners couldn't refinance because the properties weren't worth what they borrowed. The banks holding those loans couldn't foreclose because flooding the market with empty office buildings would crash values further. So everyone just held on, pretending the buildings were worth their debt levels, waiting for something to change. Mathematics doesn't wait. The defaults started in earnest in mid-April, and each default weakened the banks holding the loans, and weaker banks made depositors nervous, and nervous depositors made banks even weaker. The spiral wasn't theoretical anymore. Sarah Mitchell from Ohio, the nurse who'd watched her retirement evaporate. She made a decision in late April that she'd never thought she'd have to make. She withdrew $60,000 from her bank account, 40% of what remained of her retirement savings, and converted it to physical gold coins that she stored in the safe deposit box at a different bank across town. Sarah had spent her entire career trusting financial institutions, trusting that numbers on a screen represented real security. And now she was turning paper promises into metal she could hold, because paper promises were breaking everywhere she looked. Her financial advisor told her she was being irrational, that gold doesn't pay dividends, that she was locking in losses. Sarah didn't care. She'd watched the pattern. Silicon Valley Bank, Commonwealth Bank, the bankruptcies, the unemployment, the inflation that made her grocery bills incomprehensible. She was done trusting systems that failed the moment you needed them most. The Federal Reserve met on May 3rd for an emergency session that wasn't officially called an emergency session. The data was undeniable. GDP had contracted 0.8% in Q1. Unemployment was tracking towards 7%. Inflation was still running at 6.2% annually, despite aggressive rate hikes. The Fed was facing the impossible choice they'd tried to avoid for 3 years. Cut rates to help the economy and risk accelerating inflation, or hold rates high and watch the recession deepen into something worse. They voted to hold rates unchanged, released a statement about patience and data dependency, and every economist who understood the situation knew what that vote really meant. The Fed had lost control. They couldn't cut without destroying the dollar's credibility. They couldn't raise without destroying what remained of the economy. So they froze, paralyzed by mathematics, while the crisis accelerated around them. Chen Wei in Beijing was having very different conversations in May. The Politburo Standing Committee had authorized the sale of another $240 billion in U.S. Treasuries over the next 90 days. Chen wasn't nervous about the decision. He was nervous about what happened when other central banks saw China selling and decided to sell ahead of everyone else. The game theory was brutal. If China sold alone, they'd take losses but preserve most of their wealth. If everyone sold simultaneously, Treasury prices would collapse, and they'd lose hundreds of billions. The optimal strategy was to sell first and sell fast. But if everyone followed that strategy, the cascade would destroy the dollar as a reserve currency in weeks, not years. Chen had been in finance for 28 years, and he'd never seen a situation where every possible decision led to catastrophic outcomes. There were no good choices left, only degrees of terrible. The dollar started its real collapse in mid-May. The exchange rate against a basket of foreign currencies dropped 8% in 11 days. That doesn't sound dramatic until you understand that currency markets normally move in fractions of a percent daily. 8% in 11 days was a controlled demolition becoming uncontrolled. The Treasury Department issued statements about temporary volatility and strong fundamentals. The Fed announced a new facility to support dollar liquidity. Foreign central banks ignored both statements and continued selling. By May 23rd, the dollar had lost 19% of its value against the euro, 23% against the yen, and gold had surged to $5,200 per ounce. Sarah Mitchell's decision to convert to gold in April suddenly looked prescient instead of irrational. Oil was the trigger that turned financial crisis into something more dangerous. OPEC Plus announced on June 2nd that, effective immediately, they would accept payment for crude oil in currencies other than U.S. dollars, including yuan, euros, and gold. The statement was carefully worded and technically voluntary, But the message was clear. The petrodollar system, the arrangement that had forced every country needing oil to hold dollars since 1974, was dead. Oil prices responded immediately, jumping from $84 per barrel to $137 in 4 trading days. Gas prices in the United States went from $4.12 per gallon to $6.93 by June 9th. By June 16th, stations in California were charging $11.47, and across the country, people were filling up their tanks and storing gas in their garages, because everyone understood that prices were only going one direction. Michael Torres, the machinist who'd lost his job in February, found work in April at a warehouse for $13 an hour. The job required a 40-minute commute each way, and at $11 gas, he was spending $160 per week just driving to a job that paid $498 after taxes. The math was destroying him slower than unemployment, and by mid-June, Michael had sold his truck, bought a used motorcycle that got 60 miles per gallon, and was telling his wife Amanda that they needed to consider moving in with her parents because the mortgage payment was coming and they had $900 in the bank and no path to making it work. Michael had done everything right, worked hard, stayed employed, adapted when he lost his job, and the machinery of economic collapse was grinding him down anyway. And the rage he felt wasn't directed at anyone specific because there was nobody to be angry at except a system that broke its promises to people who kept theirs. The government implemented emergency measures in late June. Price controls on gasoline, limiting stations to $9 per gallon maximum. Rationing systems in some states, limiting purchases to 10 gallons per transaction. The controls didn't create more oil or make dollars worth more. They just created shortages. Lines at gas stations stretched for blocks. Stations ran out of fuel by mid-morning. People started filling up at 3 a.m. to avoid the crowds. The controls were making things worse, not better. But admitting that would mean admitting the problem wasn't fixable through policy. The problem was mathematical. The dollar was dying, commodities were repricing, and no amount of government intervention could change the fact that a currency losing value means everything priced in that currency costs more. Jennifer Zhao's company ran out of cash on June 27th. She'd stretched the 93 days to 107 through layoffs and expense cuts and desperate negotiations with vendors. But on June 27th, the bank account hit zero, and payroll was due, and there was no more runway left. Jennifer sent the email to all 73 employees at 4:47 p.m., explaining that the company was ceasing operations immediately. No severance. Health insurance would terminate in 14 days. She'd tried everything and failed anyway. After she sent the email, Jennifer sat in her office until 11 p.m., not because she had work to do, but because she couldn't face going home to her empty apartment and processing what had just ended. 11 years of her life, tens of millions in investor capital, research that could have saved lives. All of it terminated because the capital markets had frozen at exactly the wrong moment. Jennifer wasn't a victim of her own failures. She was a victim of timing, of being in the path of a financial avalanche that buried everything in its way, regardless of merit. The military movement started in early July, gradual enough that most Americans didn't notice, but obvious enough that anyone watching geopolitical patterns saw exactly what was happening. U.S. Navy ships increased presence in the South China Sea, from routine patrols to what military analysts called a persistent posture. Chinese vessels responded with their own increased presence. Both sides claimed they were defending freedom of navigation and international law. What they were actually doing was positioning for the possibility that resource access and trade routes might need to be secured through force instead of finance. When you can't buy what you need because your currency isn't accepted, you either go without or you take it. The positioning suggested that going without wasn't being considered as an option. The incident happened on July 16th, a Tuesday morning local time, in contested waters near the Spratly Islands. A Chinese destroyer and an American cruiser came within 200 meters of each other during maneuvers. Both sides claimed the other violated navigation rules. There was no collision, no weapons fire, but radio traffic between the vessels was hostile, and there were several minutes where commanders on both ships were calculating whether to escalate. They didn't. The ships separated. Both sides filed official protests, and the media covered it for 18 hours before moving on. But people who understood the pattern knew what that incident represented. It was the first time since World War II that American and Chinese military vessels had come close enough to hostile engagement in disputed territory, where both sides had reasons to fight. First times become precedents. Precedents become patterns. Patterns become wars. Marcus Chen liquidated another $80 million from equities into physical assets in mid-July, buying farmland in New Zealand, storing more gold in Singapore, and moving his family to Switzerland for what he told them was an extended vacation. Marcus had spent 18 months predicting this sequence, profiting from it, preparing for it, and now that the end stage was arriving, he felt something unexpected. Not guilt, because he hadn't caused any of this. Fear. Fear that the cascade was moving faster than even his models predicted. Fear that being right about the collapse meant living through it. Fear that there might not be any safe places when nuclear powers get desperate enough. Marcus had made $143 million since 2024, betting against the system. That money could buy him access and security and options, but it couldn't buy him certainty that Switzerland would stay neutral or New Zealand would stay isolated if the powers decided their survival required total war. The cyber attacks started the last week of July, and they didn't come with announcements or claims of responsibility. Power grids in Texas experienced unexplained outages, affecting 2.3 million people for 6 hours. Internet backbone infrastructure in Virginia had cascading failures that disrupted service across the eastern seaboard. Banking systems processed transactions erratically for 3 days. Cell networks in major cities dropped calls and lost data connectivity without clear technical explanations. The official statements blamed equipment failures and routine maintenance issues. The unofficial reality, the one intelligence agencies briefed to congressional committees in closed sessions, was that sophisticated actors were probing critical infrastructure for vulnerabilities and demonstrating that they could cause severe disruptions whenever they chose to make them permanent. The attacks were warnings, demonstrations of capability. The message was clear. If financial warfare escalates to military confrontation, the battlefield won't be limited to ships and planes. It'll include everything modern society depends on to function. Catherine Moore lost power for 11 hours on July 24th. Her refrigerated insulin spoiled. She called the power company 6 times and got recordings. When power came back, she drove to 3 different pharmacies trying to get her prescription refilled early. But insurance wouldn't cover it, and paying out of pocket cost $483 she didn't have. Catherine sat in her car in the pharmacy parking lot with an insulin pen that needed refrigeration and no way to ensure her power wouldn't cut out again. And the thought that kept cycling through her mind was that she taught 3rd grade for 37 years, shaped hundreds of young lives, followed every rule, saved what she could, and now she was 68 years old, rationing life-saving medication because infrastructure was failing, and her Social Security check was worth less every month, and nobody in power cared whether retired teachers lived or died. The betrayal wasn't personal. It was systematic. That made it worse. By August 1st, the pattern was undeniable, even to people who'd refused to see it before. Unemployment at 9.3%. Dow Jones down 41% from its January peak. Dollar down 34% against major currencies. Oil at $192 per barrel. Gold at $6,100 per ounce. Regional bank failures up to 13 total. Corporate bankruptcies exceeding 2,000 for the year. Consumer confidence at lows not seen since 1982. Inflation at 22% annually. The mathematics had finally overcome the narrative. The crisis wasn't coming anymore. It had arrived. It was accelerating, and every indicator suggested that the worst was ahead, not behind. David Park, the CFO whose manufacturing company filed bankruptcy in February, found consulting work in July, helping other companies navigate restructuring. The job paid well, $180,000 annually, but it meant traveling to failing companies and explaining to their leadership that bankruptcy was inevitable, and here's how to manage the process. Every company he visited had the same story. Good products, loyal customers, competent management, and debt structures that couldn't survive the rate environment. They weren't failing because they deserved to. They were failing because the system they operated within had broken, and individual merit meant nothing against systemic collapse. By early August, David had worked with 6 companies representing 11,000 jobs. He was being paid to be the messenger of economic death, and the psychological weight of that role was crushing him in ways he couldn't articulate to his wife or colleagues. He dedicated his career to building companies, creating value, sustaining employment. Now he was documenting their destruction, while the mechanisms that caused it continued accelerating beyond anyone's ability to stop. The emergency congressional session on August 7th lasted 14 hours and accomplished nothing, because there was nothing to accomplish. The debt was $39.2 trillion and growing by $8 billion per day. Interest payments were consuming 54% of all tax revenue. The Fed couldn't cut rates without destroying the dollar further. They couldn't raise rates without triggering immediate depression. Congress couldn't pass stimulus because foreign bond buyers had stopped accepting new Treasury issuance at any rate. They couldn't cut spending because the mandatory programs that consumed most of the budget were politically untouchable. Every option led to catastrophe. The only choice left was which catastrophe to choose, and choosing meant accepting responsibility for the suffering that followed. So they adjourned with no action, issued statements about bipartisan commitment to solutions, and went home to districts where constituents were losing jobs and homes and hope at rates that made everyone demand answers nobody in power could provide. The moment everything changed came on August 19th. It wasn't dramatic. There was no explosion or announcement or declaration. China simply stopped accepting US dollars for payment on existing contracts. Not publicly, not officially, but in practice, Chinese exporters began refusing dollar payment and demanding settlement in yuan, euros, or gold. American companies needing Chinese manufacturing discovered that their purchase orders were rejected unless they could pay in non-dollar currencies. The change was immediate and irreversible, and it meant that the world's second-largest economy had functionally decoupled from the dollar system. Within 48 hours, other countries began following the same pattern. The dollar hadn't been officially replaced as reserve currency. It was being quietly abandoned by everyone who understood that holding dollars meant holding losses, and the transition from dominance to irrelevance was happening in real time across thousands of transactions that individually seemed small, but collectively represented the end of 80 years of American financial hegemony. The mathematics didn't care about legacy or power or history. The mathematics cared that $39 trillion in debt couldn't be serviced, that the currency used to print that debt was losing legitimacy, and that systems built on assumptions of perpetual dollar dominance were collapsing, exactly the way they had in 1914, when the pound sterling died, and exactly the way they had in 1939, when European financial systems disintegrated. The pattern didn't repeat, because history had a sense of irony. It repeated because human beings make the same mistakes when facing the same impossible choices. And August 2026 was the moment when those choices ran out entirely, and what came next would be decided by people desperate enough to believe that force could recover what finance had lost. We started this journey with a lie they told you about how wars begin. And now you understand why that lie exists. It exists because if people recognize the pattern, if they saw that every major conflict in the last century started not with madmen and invasions, but with currency collapse and unpayable debt, they'd realize we're not studying history. We're living inside it right now, in late 2025, watching the same mechanisms activate in the same sequence, with the same mathematical inevitability. Sarah Mitchell is still working as a nurse practitioner in Columbus. She's 59 now, not 58 like when we met her at the beginning. Her 401k recovered slightly from that 42% drop, back up to about 68% of what it was. But she doesn't trust those numbers anymore. She converted another $30,000 to physical gold in September, stores it in 2 different locations, and has started teaching herself about home food storage because the grocery bills that shocked her a year ago now feel normal, and she knows that normal is just the new baseline before things get worse. Sarah didn't become a prepper or a conspiracy theorist. She just learned to read the pattern. When systems show you they can't protect you, believing they'll protect you anyway isn't optimism. It's delusion. Marcus Chen moved his family permanently to Lucerne in October 2025. His fund is up $217 million since 2024, primarily from positions that bet against the stability of Western financial systems. And he's converting more of that digital wealth into physical assets every quarter. Marcus isn't celebrating. He's running scenarios for what happens when the pattern he's been tracking crosses from financial crisis into military escalation. And none of those scenarios end well for anyone, including people with money stored in Switzerland. The mathematics that made him wealthy are the same mathematics that might make wealth irrelevant if the nuclear powers decide that resource competition requires total war. Marcus sees the pattern more clearly than almost anyone, and that clarity doesn't bring comfort. It brings the understanding that being right about collapse means living through collapse, and there might not be any real distance between Singapore and Virginia when the grid goes down. Here's the contrarian truth that should reshape how you think about the next 5 years. This isn't a prediction. It's not prophecy. It's pattern recognition across 3 centuries of financial history, showing you that sovereign debt crises of this magnitude have never, not once, resolved peacefully through policy or reform. They resolve through currency destruction, wealth confiscation, or war. Sometimes all 3. The pattern doesn't repeat because governments are evil or leaders are stupid. It repeats because the mathematics of compound interest on unpayable debt always, eventually, overwhelms political will. And when it does, desperate powers make desperate choices. We're not approaching that moment. We're in it. And the only variable left is how quickly the acceleration happens, and whether the people watching understand what they're seeing before it's too late to adapt. Picture a map of the world in your mind. But instead of showing countries and borders, you're seeing debt levels as heat signatures. The United States glowing bright red with $39 trillion. China orange with their hidden local government debt. Japan crimson with their ratio of debt to GDP exceeding 250%. Europe a patchwork of red and orange. The entire developed world drowning in obligations that can't be serviced at current interest rates and can't be refinanced at any rate foreign holders find acceptable. That's not opinion. That's accounting. And that map shows you exactly why the decoupling Marcus bet on and Chen Wei executed isn't some temporary trade dispute. It's the beginning of the end of a global financial system that ran for 80 years on the assumption that debt could grow forever, and someone would always accept dollars as payment. Catherine Moore died on November 3, 2025. Heart failure, brought on by inconsistent medication because she'd been rationing her insulin after the power failures in July. She was 68 years old, survived by 2 daughters who found out at the funeral that their mother had been cutting pills in half and skipping doses to save money, and who felt a level of rage at the system that let this happen that they couldn't express at a church service, but that will shape how they see the world for the rest of their lives. Catherine Moore followed every rule. She taught 3rd grade for 37 years. She saved what she could. She trusted Social Security and FDIC insurance, and the promise that working hard meant security in retirement. And she died alone in her Arizona home, 300 miles from her nearest daughter, because the system broke its promises while bailing out Silicon Valley depositors in 72 hours, with $215 billion in printed money. The injustice isn't abstract, it's specific. It has a name, and a date, and a cause of death that won't be listed on any official record, but that you and I both know was systemic collapse measured in rationed medication. So here's the framework. The 3 questions you should be asking yourself, not to predict the future, but to understand the present. First, if the crisis was contained, if everything was recovering, why are gold prices still at all-time highs in every major currency? Second, if the dollar was stable, if reserve currency status was secure, why are central banks from China to Saudi Arabia to India continuing to dump treasury bonds and diversify into anything except dollar-denominated assets? Third, if the economy was healthy, if corporate balance sheets were strong, why are bankruptcy filings and unemployment claims both trending in directions that only happen before recessions that everyone will later admit were obvious? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're data points. And the data points draw a map that shows exactly where this goes if the pattern holds the way it held in 1914 and 1939. James Rodriguez, the Miami developer who couldn't refinance $63 million at the new rates. He lost the property in foreclosure in August 2025. The building his family was supposed to inherit is now owned by a distressed asset fund that bought it for 38 cents on the dollar, and will hold it vacant until markets recover, if they recover. James filed personal bankruptcy in September, spent November working as a project manager for someone else's development company, and told his wife in late December that he'd been too optimistic, too trusting that the system that worked for 30 years would keep working. The moment he understood was sitting in bankruptcy court, watching the judge approve the liquidation, watching 30 years of work get reduced to line items on a legal document, and realizing that the rules had changed, but nobody told the people playing by the old rules until they'd already lost. The military posturing that started in July hasn't stopped. Naval presence in the South China Sea remains at levels that military historians compare to 1939 in the Atlantic. The cyber attacks haven't escalated beyond demonstrations, but the vulnerabilities they exposed remain unpatched. The currency markets continue their slow-motion collapse, masked by official statements about resilience and temporary volatility. And the people making decisions about whether financial crisis becomes military crisis are the same people who've made the same decisions in every previous cycle, which means the outcome is predictable, even if the exact timing isn't. We're not here to tell you what to do with your money or your life. That's not the purpose. The purpose was to show you the pattern, to prove to you that what looks like chaos and bad luck and unfortunate timing is actually mathematical inevitability playing out exactly the way it's played out before when empires printed too much money, borrowed too much capital, and refused to admit the system was broken until breaking became undeniable. You're not watching previews of a crisis coming in 2026 or 2027. You're living in Act 2 of a crisis that started the moment 38 trillion in debt crossed the threshold where mathematics stopped caring about politics. Sarah Mitchell doesn't know what happens next, but she knows the old assumptions don't work anymore. Marcus Chen has made generational wealth betting on collapse. But wealth doesn't insulate you from living through the collapse you profited from predicting. Catherine Moore is gone, a casualty of a system that protected banks and sacrificed teachers. And you, sitting here at the end of this video, you have a choice that wasn't available to any of them. You can see the pattern now. You can understand that wars don't start when soldiers cross borders. They start when the money dies, and desperate powers choose force over failure. The bill for 80 years of deficit spending and 3 decades of zero-interest money printing and the arrogant assumption that reserve currency status meant immunity from economic reality is coming due in 2026. And the only question left is whether it gets paid in currency collapse or whether it gets paid the way it always gets paid when empires fall and mathematics catches up to promises and the people in power decide that erasing the debt through war is cheaper than admitting they destroyed the system they were trusted to protect. You can't stop the pattern, but you can choose not to be blind to it.